Hi there everyone, welcome to this week's video on Plato's Apology. Now, we are treating Plato's Apology as sort of this part of this series of dialogues that Plato did that are sort of about the life and death of Socrates, specifically sort of focusing on his trial and eventual execution at the behest of the Athenian people. And in a way, the apology is really the centerpiece of this entire sequence of dialogues, right? Here, it's important to understand that apology, right? Plato is not going to have Socrates go up and say that he's sorry about being a philosopher or anything like that. In fact, it's pretty much the opposite. Instead, it sort of draws on these more ancient roots of the word apology to mean something like defense, right? And so, what we see in this dialogue, we sort of open up to Socrates giving sort of his rebuttal to the charges that were brought against him that we started to discuss in the Euthyphro, but didn't really analyze in much detail. Now, we don't really get to see the prosecution, right? We don't witness the speeches of Socrates' accusers for Plato, but we can see a lot of what they're saying about Socrates, their charges that they're bringing against him, and so on, in Socrates' rebuttal. That is basically the whole of this dialogue, right? In a way, the apology is not really a dialogue, right? It's more of a monologue. Socrates is up there and he's kind of talking, right? Giving, in fairness, what must be the speech of his lifetime, right? To his accusers and to the broad Athenian people who are part of the jury deciding whether or not Socrates has committed wrongdoing. And this text is really, really important. Like every time I teach Introduction to Philosophy, I teach this text because Socrates does a great job of not only saying kind of like what philosophy is all about, but embodying philosophy and especially a Greek notion of philosophical character in his way of behaving, right? And so the apology is quite interesting because it not only gives an account or something of how it is that we should live our lives, but in fact, the question of how we should live our lives is itself lived by Socrates in this dialogue and in the related Socratic dialogues. So our main interest today is to discuss some of the charges that are brought up against Socrates, to discuss some of Socrates' responses to these charges, and also to understand why the events of the apology transpired as they did, right? So to give a little recap on just what happens in this dialogue, right? We open up and Socrates is giving a speech in his defense. He admits no wrongdoing whatsoever. He claims that his behavior as a philosopher is fundamentally justified, and that basically he will not give up philosophizing under any context, right? And so the accusers of Socrates prevail. He's found guilty as charged. And then there's sort of second phase of the trial where they argue about what the sentence should be, right? And Socrates' speech has to some extent, swayed some people that are on the jury. And so it's very likely, that Socrates could have gotten off with either being exiled or some other sort of similar slap on the wrist, right? But Socrates refuses this. Socrates says, well, if you really want to give me what I deserve, you should treat me to a feast, right? He's saying, you should treat me as good as you treat the Olympians, who are some of the most highly, respected, lauded people in Greek life. And they got to go to this essentially, lunchroom, cafeteria that was especially for them, the Pyreneum. And Socrates says essentially, yeah, my punishment should be that you should give me free meals there for a year, right? Of course, this pisses everyone off, and ultimately, Socrates is sentenced to death, right? And in the next couple of dialogues that we'll be examining too, like the Crito and the Phaedo, these dialogues also concern this experience of Socrates going to his execution, right? And eventually having to drink hemlock and be executed. It's worth, just pausing for a second to note that, drinking hemlock is like very, very extreme. If you look at like kind of how painful that kind of death is, right? This is very much sort of like a part of, Plato's characterization of Socrates. Plato is constantly characterizing Socrates as a kind of philosophical hero. And we do, in fact, know that this trial is not fictional. It did take place in 399 BC. This is, however, Plato's own stylization, right, of these real events. This is how he portrayed his mentor in philosophy, right? So we're going to examine various aspects of how Socrates behaves as well as aspects of his defense in order to get a sense for him about what his account of a meaningful life is and entails. So up at the top we have Plato's Apology, and in this little column here to the left we have a listing of the charges that are brought against Socrates and Socrates' own response to these charges. Importantly, this is not exactly exhaustive, right? Socrates, being an ancient Greek, right, doesn't kind of go through and reply to them, oh, you said, first of all, I'm corrupting youth, and here's my 3 responses, or whatever, right? It's not really discreet in that way. And part of what Socrates says is that he's not like a skilled orator or something like that, right? And this is actually going to be an important part of his defense. So, the arguments come up sort of like as he thinks of them. At least that's how things are presented. So if you feel like he not only had the response that I'm saying that he had to this charges, but he also had some other kind of response, then that's actually very likely true, right? This is just sort of to help us get a handle on at least some of what Socrates is saying in response to these charges. So let's get a sense of the charges first before we begin on Socrates' responses to the charges. Now, Anytus and Miletus, the people sort of leading the trial against Socrates, they primarily bring up 3 charges. Though the implication is that there's this sort of hidden 4th charge, as we'll discuss, right? They accuse Socrates of corrupting the youth, of making the weaker arguments the stronger, and of being impious, right? These are not exactly legal charges as we would have them today, right? So, like, what do they mean, really, right? So here, what Socrates' prosecutors are really trying to say, in a way, is that Socrates is someone who goes around and he convinces people that they don't know, say, what piety or justice or virtue is or anything like that, right? And Socrates encourages not only himself to raise these questions, but also it sort of naturally leads other people to raise these questions too. And so what Socrates does, in a way, is he tries to go to these people that claim to be educators that claim to be people that are dispensing wisdom. And these people are sophists in the ancient Greek context. Now, this might be review for some of you, but the word sophist comes from the same root as like the word sophisticated, right? And so what a sophist was meant to do was to be something like a mix between a lawyer and a teacher, and to provide an education to Athenians, but especially education as it pertains to like a kind of civic education, right? The sort of education that you need, for example, to sway a jury, right, in a trial or something like that, right? And so sophists are often very concerned with teaching young people how to give speeches, how to effectively convince other people, and so on. And so you can see that a lot of the charges against Socrates, in essence, accuse him of being a sophist, right? They accuse him of being somebody who wants to educate young people, who, is so skilled at rhetorical argument and so on, that he can make the weaker argument the stronger. He can convince people that they're wrong about things that they're genuinely right about, right? And this causes people to doubt or deny the existence of the deities, right? The various sort of spiritual beings that the Greeks believed in, right? And so, in essence, the charges are not only that Socrates is a sophist, right? He's someone going around trying to teach the young and upset the established order, but he's also like a sophist that is particularly annoying, right? Whereas other sophists sort of claim to give these accounts of justice and wisdom and so on, and therefore teach it to young people. Now, instead, we have this view where what Socrates does is actually undermine everyone's established notion of these concepts. He doesn't train people how to be skilled or how to gain political power or anything like that, right? But instead, part of his response is for him to say that he's teaching them not certain answers to questions, but to seek wisdom, right? And that's really the essence of philosophy, is not in being the sophist, to the person that claims to have all the answers, the person that can claim to convince everyone, the center of political power in Athens, right? But it's instead, essential to think about education as centered around the philosopher, right? And the essence of Socrates' response to the prosecution is to claim that he's not a sophist, he's not one of these sophisticated people that goes around and pretends to have wisdom, but that he's a philosopher. He's someone that genuinely loves wisdom and seeks it out and doesn't claim to be like selling it, for example, right? And so whereas the accusers say, oh, you're going around, you're corrupting the youth, you're, getting all of these followers and so on, Socrates' response is to say, well, what I say all the time is that I have no wisdom, right? Other dialogues sort of portray Socrates as being this old man that goes along with these young people to learn from the sophists, right? And so he ends up questioning them and, kind of battling them philosophically a lot. But he goes in being like, well, I have no wisdom, and they at least claim to have wisdom, so I should, at least try to learn from them, right? And similarly, they accuse him of making the weaker argument the stronger, but Socrates emphasizes that he has no rhetorical skill or political power, right? People aren't like enamored with him when they talk to him. They think he's annoying, right? And similarly, where they say that Socrates, denies the existence of the ancient Greek gods, right? Denies the existence of the deities. Socrates claims to the contrary, that his philosophical activity is a way of worshiping his daimon, right? His daimon is like, people generally interpret it as his sort of conscience, right? Speaking to him, that tells him that he must philosophize, right? And so far from not believing in the God, Socrates, to the contrary, thinks that his philosophizing is a way of, being faithful to the gods, in essence, right? Okay, so, part of Socrates' apology, part of his claim for why he is not a sophist, is that he went to this, religious location, the Oracle at Delphi. And this is a place where a lot of leaders of Athenian life, generals, etc., would go to ask questions to sort of get, some kind of wisdom or guidance in their life, right? And Socrates is puzzled because the Oracle at Delphi claims that he is the wisest man in all of Athens, right? But his whole shtick, right, his whole thing, in a way, is simply to claim that he doesn't have wisdom, right? So Socrates then is really puzzled. He's sort of asking himself, like, how can it be? I know that the Oracle at Delphi is this religious magical source, right? How could they be wrong about that? And then Socrates says, well, I'm going to refute them. I'm going to demonstrate that there's somebody in Athens that's wiser than I am, right? And so now we have to get an account of what is Socrates' wisdom versus the wisdom given by, say, the sophist, right? The sophist claims to know things, to dispense wisdom to people. How is Socrates' wisdom, which the Oracle of Delphi says is superior, different from that? So I have 4 quotations that I want us to look at together, separated into these 4 rows. So let's go down the first row. Here, Socrates, you can see, is responding to the charge about his reputation as being a sophist, right? People think that he's a sophist, people think that he is upsetting the established order, and so on, right? And here he argues, what caused my reputation is none other than a certain kind of wisdom. What kind of wisdom? Human wisdom, perhaps, right? So, whereas previously, Socrates, it's sort of the essence of his character to claim that he doesn't have wisdom, right? Here, he claims to have a certain kind of wisdom, right? And what he calls human wisdom. And our next quote gives an account of what that wisdom is. Quote, I am wiser than this man. You can say that, this is the sophist. This is someone who claims to know something, right? I am wiser than this man. Why? It is likely that neither of us knows anything worthwhile. Okay? So Socrates says straight up, okay, let's begin. Neither of us know anything all that important, right, about divine things, about the gods and so on, right? Neither of us knows anything worthwhile, right? But what is the difference? Here we get the difference. But he thinks he knows something when he does not. Whereas when I do not know, neither do I think that I know, right? So the sophist doesn't know stuff, but lives in ignorance about not knowing, right? The sophist thinks they know things, they don't actually know things, right? Socrates then says, so I am likely to be wiser than he to this small extent, right? The extent of human wisdom, that I do not think I know what I do not know, right? And so Socrates' wisdom is sort of paradoxically connected to his ignorance, to the fact that he does not know, right? And Socrates explains going through this process of going through everybody in Athens and trying to see what they know, right? He goes to politicians. He claims that they don't really know anything. He goes to great artists, which he say like their work sort of embodies knowledge, but the artists don't even know what it's about, right? Like they're at least not any better than the spectators do. And then he goes to craftspeople and he's like, yeah, these people genuinely do have knowledge. Like they know how to, spin yarn or something like that, right? They know how to weave, but they don't have human wisdom, right? Because they think that their knowledge about how to spin yarn or whatever means that they also have knowledge about like the way that the world is, right? They think that this sort of practical knowledge can translate into genuine philosophical knowledge. And so the Oracle at Delphi was right, right? Because Socrates exhibits human wisdom by knowing his own ignorance in a way that neither the politicians, the poets, the sophists, or the craftspeople have. And this explains why it is that Socrates is so brash during his trial, right? There are many cases where, from like a practical, pragmatic standpoint, he could have gotten off things a little bit easier if he just would have, relented a little bit, right? If he would have said, oh, yes, I bear some responsibility for this wrongdoing, but this trial is, unjust and so on, right? Then it's very likely that he could have gotten off with a much lighter sentence. But he doesn't, right? He kind of makes an ass of himself. He tries to, say, hey, you should punish me by giving me a buffet every day, right? Why is he like this? Why does he behave this way? Why does he refuse to admit any wrongdoing, right? Well, the answer is that Socrates does not fear death. He does not think that, these people can wrong him, right? This is quote number 3. To fear death, gentlemen, is no other than to think oneself wise when one is not. To think one knows what one does not know, right? So Socrates says, we don't know what happens after death. It could be a good thing, it could be a bad thing, right? To fear death, right, to be invested in not dying, is in a way to claim to have knowledge when one doesn't actually have knowledge, right? And so Socrates' human wisdom prevents him from fearing death, right? Socrates says things like, a good person can never be harmed by a bad person, right? And this is very confusing to us as contemporary readers, right? Because you can get stabbed, you can get, your body can be hurt in all these ways by people that, you might think are bad people, so on. But what Socrates is saying, right, is that the real way to hurt you would not be to hurt your body, it would be to hurt your soul, right? And the way that you hurt your soul is when you do not do what you know is right, right? And so Socrates believes that he would be committing a moral wrongdoing. He would be hurting his own soul, right, to admit any degree of wrongdoing for his behavior, because he fully intends to continue philosophizing up to his death. And if it's really reached the point where these people want to kill him because of that, then generally his attitude is, let it be, right? I won't besmirch myself by lying to my own political community, right? Socrates still has some degree of respect for Athens, which requires that he not lie, right? That he not have this sort of pragmatic approach where he admits some wrongdoing for something where he doesn't think that he behaved wrongly. So Socrates says at the very end, and this is a very, very strong claim, the unexamined life is not worth living. In other words, a world where Socrates could not philosophize in peace, a world where perhaps Athens accepted him, but only on the condition that he not continue to philosophizing, Socrates insists, is not even worth living. And it's important to stew on how strong this claim is, right? If you've never philosophized before, right, you've never reflected on what it is that you should do, right, that doesn't necessarily mean take a philosophy class. But if you haven't philosophized, it's not only that philosophy makes your life better or something like that, but that the life where you don't philosophize is not worth living, right? I mean, just think about it. We know all these people in our lives. Most of them do not philosophize, right? So it is a very, very strong claim to assert that their lives are not worth living. In other words, philosophy is not only one thing among many that makes your life worth living, but it is the only thing that makes your life worth living. We will continue this sequence of videos through discussing Plato's Crito alongside Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail. I very much look forward to continuing our discussions together. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.